The switch. Forgot about the switch. It's a real privilege to be with you here this morning, and I'm looking forward to getting to explore the opening chapters of the Bible, hopefully in ways that will be beneficial and edifying. And so let me begin by making a few general remarks about the opening chapters of the Bible. I think that in many ways we can say that the opening chapters of the Bible, Genesis 1 and 2 in particular, and we could also throw in the third chapter for a broader consideration, is that these are chapters that are familiar to us because we know the basic outline of the story. We can say that God created everything that we see, and not only did he create the heavens and the earth, but he also created mankind, male and female, Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve, of course, were placed in the garden. And then after that, they were given a command not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And we all know how that turned out. It didn't turn out well. And I think that what happens is that we look at that story and we think that, okay, I've got the basics, I think I understand it, and now let me move on. And so we move on. But I think that one of the things that we don't realize is that there are a lot of details in the text that perhaps we're not completely aware because we're not reading as carefully or as slowly as we ought. Martin Luther, in his commentary on the book of Genesis, notes in the beginning of his work there that according to one of the church fathers, Jerome translated the Bible out of Hebrew and Greek into Latin, giving us what is now known as the Latin Vulgate. He translated that, and one of the things that he noted is that the ancient Jewish scholars would not let a young rabbi comment or teach upon the opening chapters of Genesis until he was at least 30 years old, because they believed that the content of the book was so important, but not only important, but in many ways complex. Now, another, I think, approach that we have to the book of Genesis that comes to us is the idea that we want to ask scientific questions of the Bible. And I think that in one sense, it's entirely natural for us to want to do so. We want to ask these scientific questions of the Bible because when we read the opening chapters of the Bible, they deal with the heavens and the earth. And so our natural reaction is to look up and look around and look at the mountains, look at the sky, look at the sun, look at the moon. And so we want to understand more about the opening chapters of the Bible. And so we look up and look around. But at the same time, in our own context, we are inevitably driven to ask questions that science and many scientists put forward that seemingly contradict the Genesis account. And so we want resolutions to those questions. And so we ask questions about science, about how old the earth is, about whether or not Adam and Eve had any kind of, what they call pre-Adamites. In other words, was Adam evolved, etc., etc. And I think that when we come to ask these questions, sometimes we might be distracted away from asking questions that the Bible itself is more interested in answering. From that vantage point, we should ask ourselves this first question, and that as helpful and as informative as the Bible can be about addressing some of those scientific questions, we should want to first instead ask ourselves, how does the Bible itself treat the opening chapters of the Bible? When the Bible itself goes back to explain what's going on, what kinds of questions is it answering? What kinds of things is it putting forth? So, for example, it was St. Augustine who said, what is hidden in the Old Testament is revealed in the new, and what is revealed in the new is hidden in the old. Another way to put that statement is to say that the New Testament is the inerrant, infallible commentary on the Old Testament. If you want one of the earliest, if not the earliest commentaries on the Old Testament, well, you want to turn to the New Testament. And so from that vantage point, we should say, what is it and how is it that the New Testament explains what's going on in the Old Testament? And from that vantage point, I think we begin to read the Bible in the way that the Scriptures themselves are intended for us to come to them. So, when the Apostle Paul, for example, calls Christ in 1 Corinthians 15:45 the last Adam, that should point to us and say, hey, Paul is interacting here with the opening chapters of the Bible, with Genesis itself. Why does he call him the last Adam? Why, in Romans chapter 5, does Paul say that Adam was a type of the one who was to come? In other words, what is a type? Well, a type is a foreshadow, something that anticipates, predicts, or loosely foreshadows a person, place, or thing later to come in the New Testament. And so what that means is that if Adam is a foreshadow of Christ, we should ask ourselves, well, in what way is he a foreshadow of Christ? How does he anticipate Christ? And so I think that when we come at it from that vantage point, we begin to understand, hopefully, the Scriptures in a much clearer way. I think from that vantage point, a very large book of the Bible all of a sudden becomes a lot smaller, because then we begin to read the Bible as the Bible itself was intended to be read, and we understand its broader storyline, and then we can take a lot of the individual pieces of the puzzle and put them together to convey a coherent story. So I think that what we're about to unpack over the next 4 lectures, this one and then 3 more after that, I think in many ways you're going to be very familiar with the pieces of the puzzle. It's just that, and I haven't seen one of these pictures in a long, long time, so maybe this is dating me, but I used to go to the mall. Maybe those are outdated, I don't know. I used to go to the mall, and you'd see the little cart in this thing, and they used to have those 3D posters. I mean, they claimed they were 3D. I could never see it. I mean, maybe that just says something about my own dullness. But they would say that if you look at it a certain way, and I tried. I mean, I just could never see it, you know. But if you look at it a certain way, all of a sudden the 3D image would jump out at you. And it's not that the image changed. It's not that the content changed, but rather it's that it was there all along. It's just that it required you to look at it from a certain angle. And I think that's the way that we want to see a lot of this material here that we're about to encounter, is that you're familiar with it, I think, in many ways. It's just that you haven't quite looked at it from this angle. And in looking at it from this angle, hopefully it opens up, perhaps for some, maybe not all, but for a good number of you, it'll open up a whole new window on looking at the opening chapters of the Bible. Okay? So with that being said and done, what I want us to unpack here in this first lecture period is the idea that the Garden of Eden is not a farm. It's not a farm. Because when we read its account, and you'd be surprised in that there are a lot of commentators, very scholarly people, that will say that Adam was the first farmer and that this was the first farm. And I think it's only natural for us to come to that conclusion. He's placed into this garden, and it's filled with trees, and he's told to tend and to keep it. And they're supposed to eat, and they're supposed to live, and it looks a lot like a farm. Okay? But what it is rather we want to say that this is the first earthly temple. It is the first earthly temple, and Adam is the first priest. He's the first priest. Not a farmer, but a priest. And so there are a number of features that we want to look at when we look here at the temple, and particularly the temple in the garden, that is. And that the first idea is that where is the garden located? Well, the garden is located, from what the narrative tells us, it is located in the east, according to Genesis chapter 2, verse 8. It's located in the east. Now, this feature might not seem all that significant to us, but when we look into other portions of the Scriptures, we see that the east is a direction with some theological significance. According to Ezekiel, and we're going to be looking at Ezekiel back and forth, a number of points. But in Ezekiel chapter 11, verse 1, Ezekiel chapter 11, verse 1, and then later Ezekiel 11:23, we read this: "The Spirit lifted me up and brought me to the east gate of the house of the Lord, which faces the east." Here, the prophet is brought to the temple, and he is now at the east gate. "And the glory of the Lord," verse 23, "went up from the midst of the city and stood on a mountain that is on the east side of the city." Later on in chapter 43, verses 1 and following, "Then he led me to the gate facing east, and behold, the glory of the God of Israel was coming from the east. And the sound of his coming was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. And the vision I saw was just like the vision that I had seen when he came to destroy the city, and just like the vision that I had seen by the Kebar Canal. I fell on my face as the glory of the Lord entered the temple by the gate facing east. And the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the temple." Here in this Ezekiel narrative, you have the narrative begins with the glory of the Lord departing from the east because in judgment, but then later on, at the end of the book, when Ezekiel is given these visions of this perfect temple, the glory of the Lord returns from the east. And all of this occurs where the temple faces the east at its east gate. The east is a significant direction in the Old Testament because it is the direction from which the glory of the Lord comes and goes. I think that the Gospel of Luke picks this up when Luke is talking about the glory of the revelation of the gospel, and in Luke chapter 1, verses 78 and 79, we see that because of the tender mercy of our God, whereby the sunrise shall visit us from on high, to give light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet onto the way of peace. Here, Luke is talking about and likening the revelation of the gospel as to the rising of the sun, which, of course, rises in the east. Okay? So that's one factor that we want to sit here and we want to note. The temple, or this Garden of Eden, is in the east. Now, what I'm about to say as we continue to go forward is, you remember this. Any one of these individual characteristics, I think in my mind, doesn't necessarily or absolutely convince us that the garden is the first temple. But when we begin to stack up all of these different features, all of them collectively together, I think most certainly gives us that conclusion. Secondly, we know that the Garden of Eden, from the Genesis narrative, sits on top of an elevated surface. How do we know that it sits on an elevated surface? From the narrative itself, when you read in Genesis chapter 2, verses 10 and following, what is it that comes out of the Garden of Eden? A river. And what do rivers do? Run downhill. Never seen a river run uphill. I mean, maybe somewhere it has. I don't know. You'll find out very quickly. I don't know much else about anything else. So don't ask me questions about math, geometry, chemistry, anything like that. I would be very much in trouble. But here we know, at least from the narrative itself, that water flows from the top to the bottom so that the Garden of Eden sits on some sort of elevated plane. But again, we know from the book of Ezekiel here, where the prophet is uttering forth judgment against the king of Tyre and likening the judgment to the parallels between the Garden of Eden and the king of Tyre's situation. And in Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 13 and 14, Ezekiel explicitly identifies the Garden of Eden as a mountain. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering: sardius, topaz, and diamond, beryl, onyx, and jasper, sapphire, emerald, and carbuncle, and crafted in gold were your settings and your engravings. On the day that you were created, they were prepared. You were an anointed guardian cherub. I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. In the midst of the stones of fire you walked. So notice here, Ezekiel identifies the Garden of Eden as the holy mountain of God, not simply just an elevated surface, not simply a little hill, but rather a mountain. Okay? Now, where else in the Bible do we know about God's dwelling places, and how many of those other dwelling places are mountains? Well, I think we would say that just about all of them. The Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai, where God dwells atop Mount Sinai. When the psalmist, for example, talks about God's dwelling place, he talks about it as Mount Zion. Psalm chapter 48, verses 1 and 2. And then, of course, where most famously do we know about the mountain dwelling place of God from the New Testament? Can you think of any of those locations? Not the Mount of Olives, but... and it's good. I want you to, I always tell my class, be bold with your answers. Don't be afraid of being wrong. That's what the learning process is about. So I always say, go big or go home. Just let it fly. And the worst that I'll say is, well, not quite.
Transfiguration, the mountain where they went up to the Transfiguration.
Okay, that's a good idea there. The Mount Transfiguration there, atop a mountain. But more specifically, and by the way, that was a great way to go big. I like that. You have in Hebrews chapter 12 or Revelation chapter 21, Hebrews chapter 12, Mount Zion, described there as the general assembly, if you will, of the saints. So all of God's dwelling places and other portions of the Scriptures are described as mountains. All right? So here, it's located in the east. The Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden is located atop a mountain. Thirdly, we know from what we just discussed about its mountaintop location, one of the ways that we determined that it was sitting atop a mountain is that a river flows out of it. This is yet another feature that points to the temple identity of the Garden of Eden, because Genesis 2:5 tells us the river flows out from the mountain. And again, throughout the Scriptures, rivers, water flows out of God's temples. Think about Ezekiel's vision of this perfect temple, this vision that he has. So in Ezekiel 47, verse 1, then he brought me back to the door of the temple, and behold, water was issuing forth from below the threshold of the temple toward the east. For the temple faced east, the water was flowing down from below the south end of the threshold of the temple, south of the altar. So here in this vision of this perfect temple, water is issuing forth from beneath the threshold. Joel chapter 3. Joel chapter 3, verse 18, talking about the temple of the Lord in the last day. And in that day the mountains shall drip sweet wine, and the hills shall flow with milk, and all the stream beds of Judah shall flow with water. And a fountain shall come forth from the house of the Lord and water the valley. Zechariah chapter 14, verse 8. On that day, living waters shall flow out from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea and half of them to the western sea. It shall continue in summer as in winter. But then, of course, at least in terms of kind of the capstone, Revelation chapter 22, verse 1, then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb. So in all of these temples, you have water flowing from them. Water flowing from them. And now here's another thing. We'll have to put this one out here to the side because we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. But In the New Testament, who does the New Testament identify as the temple of the living God? Yeah, Jesus and the church. Jesus is the cornerstone. Okay, strike me down and I will be raised up. I'll raise up. Strike down this temple and I will raise it up in 3 days. In the Gospel of John. But then he says, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 3:16, you are the temple of the living God. Ephesians 2, we're being joined together. 1 Peter 2, you're living stones being built upon chief cornerstone of Christ. What does Jesus say that will flow from your heart? Living waters? You are the temple, water flowing from you. John chapter 7, verse 38, whoever believes in me, as the scripture said, out of his heart will flow water, rivers of living water. All right, so there's one of these little side connections here, but it's a piece of the puzzle, if you will, that you know. But now we're just kind of stringing it all together. It's in the east, sits atop of a mountain, has water flowing from it, Fourthly, we know very clearly from the Genesis text, the narrative, that the Garden of Eden was filled with trees. Now, throughout the rest of the scriptures, there are numerous appearances of trees in various contexts, so that, for example, we can talk about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is described in the following manner, according to the Genesis narrative in chapter 3, verse 6. So the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise. Delight to the eyes, make one wise. Now listen to the description of the law of God in Psalm 19, verses 8 and 9. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. And in other portions of the scripture, we know that the law of God is there to teach wisdom. So I think in this respect, we can say that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is there representative of God's law. And in fact, they say that the terminology in terms of the description of the law and the tree of knowledge of good and evil are similar, very, very similar. Now, what do we have appearing in subsequent temples? We have the law that shows up in subsequent temples. Where is the law kept in the tabernacle? Yeah, in the ark. Put the law inside the ark inside the Holy of Holies. It's kept there inside of the Holy of Holies in the temple later on in the days of Solomon. All right. We also know that the law, if we are the temple of the living God, what has God inscribed upon our hearts? Law. All right. So that's one piece of the puzzle. The tree of life is another tree that appears in the garden. And does anybody know, and anybody remember, and it comes to us from the 25th chapter of Exodus, that the temple menorah, we see that the menorah typically around Hanukkah, around Christmas time when Jewish people celebrate Hanukkah, and we see this candlestick, and it has 7 little branches, if you will, on it. But does anybody remember what the menorah is designed after? Not an olive tree, but an almond tree. Close. Almond tree. Interesting that the menorah is designed after an almond tree. And where was this menorah to be kept but inside the temple? And in fact, we can't be absolutely sure, but what a lot of scholars seem to think is that the menorah, as an almond tree, was supposed to be evocative of the tree of life. So what that potentially means is that the forbidden fruit was not an apple, And the reason that got into our theological discussion is that, let's see if I can remember this correctly, the Latin word for apple is malus. And malice is very close to the Latin word for evil. And so that's how we get the idea that it's apple. But it could have very well been, I'm not going to say for sure, but it could have very well been that the forbidden fruit was an almond. I don't know. But the point is this, is that the menorah is connected to the idea of a tree, and the tree is present there in the midst of the tabernacle and later into the temple. Now, of course, we know that in the rest of the Genesis narrative, from Genesis chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, that there are other trees there in the midst of the garden. And Ezekiel, in his constant reference back to the Garden of Eden, mentions that there are many other trees. Ezekiel chapter 31, Ezekiel 31, verses 8 and 9, the cedars in the garden of God could not rival it, nor the fir trees equal its boughs. Neither were the plane trees like its branches. No tree in the garden of God was its equal in beauty. I made it beautiful in the mass of its branches, and all the trees of Eden envied it that were in the garden of God. So here, Ezekiel identifies all these other kinds of trees. Now, here we go. When you look at the temple later on in the days of Solomon, does anybody remember what it is that's carved in gold along the walls of the temple? Palm trees and pomegranate trees. And as a kid, I can always remember thinking, that's weird. Why trees? Well, if the temple in Solomon's day is recalling back to Adam's day in the very first temple, well then that would give us one piece of the puzzle as to the Garden of Eden is full of these trees, and this is why the subsequent temple also has decorative trees engraved all around it. But this isn't the only place that we know that there are trees in the temple. Where in the last book of the Bible do we know of trees appearing in the temple of God? Well, book of Revelation. Revelation chapter 22, verses 1 and 2. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb. So there's the river again. Through the middle of the street of the city, also on either side of the river, the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. So here's tree in God's temple. Now, here's an interesting connection, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I cannot contain my enthusiasm. And I'm doing my best to subdue it, right? But we are likened, and the righteous man is likened to what? Fruit-bearing trees. Psalm 1. All of a sudden, you start reading a lot of different passages, and you think, well, that's weird. And how does Jesus say you will know them? By their fruit. In other words, I think a lot of people think that they go and that when Jesus and the other authors of the New Testament, that they're going around doing their teaching, they think, oh, there's a fruit tree. Oh, that would be a great analogy. I'll use that. And maybe sometimes that did happen. I don't know. I don't want to just totally discount it. But I think instead, Jesus and New Testament authors are using images and ideas, not so much from their immediate context, but rather they're pulling from the Old Testament. So that in the beginning, in the opening chapter of the Bible, you have the first Adam placed in a temple surrounded by fruit-bearing trees. I don't think it's a coincidence that the last chapter of the Bible ends with the last Adam standing in the midst of his saints who are likened to fruit-bearing trees. I don't think that that's an accident. I don't think it's an accident, and especially when you begin to consider the fact that, from Revelation to Genesis, that you have a book that spans over 1,000 years and has so many different authors coming from so many different walks of life, and they all have this same consistent message. You're talking either about a huge coincidence, or you're talking about a book that has been divinely inspired from the beginning to the end. All right, so there are certainly trees all over the place. So we've got the trees of the garden. It's sitting towards the east. It's sitting atop a mountain. It has a river flowing out from it. But then fifthly, we know that the Garden of Eden is filled with precious stones and metal. I mean, I think how many of us have read past Genesis chapter 2, verses 10 and following, where it talks about onyx and gold, and we just think, oh, okay, well, that's interesting, onyx and gold. Maybe we think of, 49ers, not the football team, but, these old guys out there, sifting for gold in the river, and we think, well, maybe Adam would have done a little bit of looking for gold in the river. But again, within the broader storyline of the Old Testament, remember what we said earlier from Ezekiel chapter 28, the other precious stones that were there. In Ezekiel 28, talking about this cherubim that was there. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. And so here now, the author here, Ezekiel, is placing all kinds of precious stones there in the Garden of Eden. Sardius, topaz, diamond, beryl, onyx, jasper, sapphire, emerald, carbuncle. I don't even know what carbuncle is, but it's a fancy stone. Crafted in gold were your settings and your engravings. Gold and precious stones. Do precious stones appear in any other temples? We know from the book of Revelation that yes. In fact, the foundation of the temple itself, according to Revelation 21, the New Jerusalem is described in precisely these terms. Revelation 21, verses 10 and 11, and he carried me away in the Spirit to a great high mountain. We are on the mountain. And he showed me the holy city Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God, having the glory of God, its radiance like a most rare jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal. The wall was built of jasper, while the city was pure gold, clear as glass. Verses 19 and 20, the foundations of the wall of the city were adorned with every kind of jewel. The first was jasper, the second sapphire, agate, emerald, onyx, carnelian, chrysolite, beryl, topaz, chrysoprase, jacinth, and amethyst. So here the final temple is gloriously adorned with all of these precious stones, and its gold is brilliant. But if we take a step back and we look at, say, the Old Testament in particular, the clothing of the high priest, one of the things that Aaron, as the high priest, was supposed to wear is he was supposed to wear a breastpiece. Remember what was on that breastpiece? 12 stones, precious stones. Exodus chapter 28, verses 15 and following. You shall make a breastpiece of judgment in skilled work. In the style of an ephod you should make it, of gold, blue and purple and scarlet yarns, fine twined linen shall you make it. It shall be a square and doubled, a span its length and a span its breadth. You shall set it in 4 rows of stones. Sardius, topaz, carbuncle shall be the first row. The second, emerald, sapphire, diamond, jacinth, agate, amethyst, beryl, onyx, and jasper. They shall be set in gold filigree. There should be 12 stones. So here you have the high priest wearing these 12 stones. Now, I don't have time to substantiate it at great length, but what the high priest is wearing, he's essentially wearing a blueprint, if you will, of the temple, which is later the same stones we find in the foundation stones of the New Jerusalem. But these are also the same stones that the prophet Ezekiel says were present in the Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden. So here, again, notice the pieces of the puzzle. Precious stones and metals. The trees of the garden. Not only the trees of the garden, the river flowing from the garden. The mountaintop location, as well as its location in the east. But wait, there's more. Right? Who else was in the garden? We had God, of course. We also had Adam and Eve, but there were some other inhabitants. Well, animals, yeah. And in one sense, we can say the animals are present in terms of, say, in the final temple, where we see those fearsome creatures with the face of a lion, face of an eagle, the face of an ox. But who are those fierce creatures, and what are their names? Do you remember? Yeah, the cherubim. Go big, remember, loud, nice and loud. Belt it out there. The cherubim. We know that the cherubim are there in the garden immediately upon the fall. Now, what we might not know with a great degree of certainty is if they were there before the fall. But we know that they were there after the fall, according to Genesis 3:24. They were there to guard the entrance to the Garden of Eden. Now, Ezekiel, in Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 14, places a cherubim inside the garden. Okay, he places it inside the garden. We know from other temples that there were cherubim guarding the Holy of Holies. In Exodus chapter 25, in 1 Kings chapter 6, we know that the cherubim were embroidered upon the curtain that separated the inner temple from the Holy of Holies. What was the purpose of that curtain? Were you allowed to go past that curtain? What would have happened if you went past that curtain uninvited? Yeah, that's right, crispy critter, you're gone. In fact, they say that one of the reasons for the bells at the bottom of the high priest's robe was so that when the high priest went in once a year on the Day of Atonement, they would be able to hear him ambulating about, walking about, and so that if all of a sudden the bells stopped, they'd know, oops, I guess Levi bought it. Got scared, or maybe he did something wrong. And according to Jewish tradition, that they would tie a rope around the high priest's ankle so they could haul him out. Because can you imagine? He bought it. Go in and get him. I'm not going in there. You go in there. I'll stay out here and I'll watch the door. No. But yeah, if you went past that curtain, you were a goner. Notice it's the same function as those cherubim. If Adam and Eve had tried to go past that cherubim, they would have wielded that flaming sword. Now, later in the New Jerusalem, we know from the book of Revelation, are there cherubim there? Yes, there are. Yes, there are. There are 4 cherubim around the throne of God. Ostensibly, they're serving the same purpose. Now, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I think it's helpful, at least at this point, to anticipate a little bit. In that, through the work of Christ, what is it that happens to that temple veil? Torn from top to bottom. The way back to the throne of God is open once again. The cherubim, if you will, I think, are no longer guarding the entrance to the throne of God, but they are now retreated back to the throne of God itself, positioned around the throne of God instead of guarding its entrance. But if after the fall the cherubim are placed at the gate of the garden, then I think the implication with that is that the garden itself was the Holy of Holies. And that Adam and Eve had regular access to the Holy of Holies until they sinned. Until they sinned. So it's on the east. It's in the east. It's on top of a mountain. You have a river flowing from it. You have trees in it. You have precious metals and stones adorning it, just like the temples of old, filigreed in precious stones and gold. And you had cherubim there. But there is more, in that we should ask the question in terms of the activities of the inhabitants of the garden. What precisely were they there, and what were they supposed to do? Well, first of all, we have the presence of God himself. I don't think that we should think that God's presence was somehow unusual, The way that the narrative reads at a point might indicate that God wasn't supposed to be there on a regular basis and that Adam and Eve sinned and that's why he showed up. No, the intrusion into the narrative is not the presence of God, but rather the presence of sin. I think that's the intrusion upon the narrative. So I think we can say that God's presence there is normal. But here's what's interesting, and this seems somewhat awkward at first because it just, we think, well, that's a weird way to, account for it. But Genesis 3:8, and they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden. Walking in the garden. But when we take and account for how God is present in his temples and subsequent temples in the Old Testament, it's the same activity. Leviticus chapter 26. Leviticus 26, verses 11 and 12. I will make my dwelling among you, and my soul shall not abhor you. And I will walk among you, and will be your God, and you shall be my people. Here, God talking about his presence. And where was his presence located? There in the book of Leviticus. In the temple, in the tabernacle. When David wanted to build a temple for the Lord, a permanent house, he says this, and God responds to him in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 6, I have not lived in a house since the day that I brought the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I have been, now the ESV renders it here, moving about in a tent, but the Hebrew here, and the Greek translation of the Hebrew says, I have been walking about in a tent for my dwelling. So God's activity, as it's located in the tabernacle, is described as God walking in the tent, walking in his dwelling place. What's interesting, too, is that when we compare the account, the narrative for the plans for the tabernacle in Exodus chapter 25, we may not immediately realize it, but the plans for the tabernacle are given in 7 speeches. 7 speeches. And we have a number of parallels that exist, and they're fascinating. In Exodus chapter 26, verse 7, in the description of the tent, the psalmist says in Psalm 104, verse 2, the heavens are stretched out like a curtain, like a tent. You have the firmament of the creation described in Genesis 1:2, for which we believe that the parallel to that is the temple veil, the curtain that separated the inner temple from the Holy of Holies. Because you remember what color that veil was? Blue. And the idea is that it was representative of the heavens. And that just as the temple veil might be opened, the heavens would be opened, revealing the throne of God. You have the bronze sea, or the laver, the wash basin. Well, what is it that sits beside the throne of God in the book of Revelation? In the 4th chapter, the throne of God sits by sea of glass. You have lights that are created in the heavens. Well, there's the light stands that are created as well. You have birds in Genesis 1:20, the winged cherubim in Exodus 25. You have man that is created ostensibly as God's priest, but then you have Aaron the high priest and his labors that are described. And then finally on the 7th day, you have the cessation of labors, the blessing of the Sabbath day and its completion, and you have the same pattern in Exodus chapter 39 with the cessation and God blessing them. Now, that's very quickly. You'd have to look in greater detail, but a number of scholars, both conservative and liberal across the board, have recognized these parallels between the creation the creation account and the description of the tabernacle, so that the idea is, and you can even find this in commentators as early as Josephus, first century Jewish commentator, where he says that the tabernacle and the temple was built to represent a miniature version of the creation, and that the creation is God's greater temple. Well, the implication is we would say that the creation is the outer confines of the temple, the garden is its holy of holies. But what about Adam's responsibilities? And this is where I think a lot of people tend to think that, well, Adam was a farmer. And now this is not to be in any way derogatory towards farming. As a beneficiary of farming, because I eat things that I purchase from the grocery store, I love farmers. And I'm grateful that I can graze in the grocery store for their produce. But in Genesis 2:15, we see that the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. To work it and keep it. Now, at first glance, we think, well, that sounds like farming to me. I mean, he's supposed to work the garden and keep the garden, pulling, weeds and making sure that everything grows right, fertilizing, etc. And here's the thing, is that when you find the verb work, you can find that all over the Old Testament. And you can find the verb to keep, to guard. You can find that verb all over the Old Testament as well. But here's the interesting twist. The only places that you find those two verbs together, to work and keep, or to work and to guard, the only places that you find that is in Genesis and in the description of the duties of the priests. In Numbers chapter 3, verses 7 and 8, they shall keep, same verb that is given to Adam, they shall keep over him and over the whole congregation before the tent of meeting as they minister or as they work at the tabernacle. Same verb that is given to Adam. You find working and keeping all over the place, but the only places that you find those two verbs together is in the description of Adam's work in the garden and the responsibilities of the priests in tending to the tabernacle. If that's the case, then I think that what that tells us is that Adam's labors are not simply agricultural, but rather his labors are directed at tending and keeping the temple. And in the same way that the Old Testament priests were supposed to guard the sanctity of the temple and the tabernacle confines from anything that was unclean, that too was Adam's responsibility. And so in that respect, how is it that Adam failed in his initial labors? How did he not guard the sanctity of the temple? One word sounds like serpent, snake, there you go, right? Sometimes I like to use charades in teaching. I find it as a useful pedagogical tool, right? He should have said, Eve, what are you doing talking to that snake? Get one of the cherubim over here and dispense with it. We are supposed to guard the confines of the temple. All right? We also find in terms of Adam's clothing. Now, from one respect, I think as regularly clothed individuals, we think it very natural for Adam to want to be clothed. I mean, you think, the man and the woman, they were naked and they knew no shame. But even then you think, it just seems kind of impractical. Gardening, I don't know about that. But at least we know about clothing in the sense that it's immediately necessary because of their sin. God clothes them. And so we think, okay, well, I understand that. They are sinful, and therefore they have to be clothed. But if we take into account, again, their location, and if the garden is the first temple, then their need for clothing makes all the more sense, because the high priest was not allowed to enter the temple. He was not allowed to enter the tabernacle, what? Unclothed, naked. So that even, for example, there were no steps. Why were there no steps? Because back then, they wore the long, I don't know what else to call it, skirt, okay, robe, right? And to lift it would expose the priest. The priest was not allowed to be naked in his presence. According to Exodus chapter 20, verse 26, and Exodus 28, verse 42. And in particular, what's interesting is when you read early Jewish commentators and what they have to say about this is they say that Adam's vestments, his clothing, were the first clothing for the first priest, the first high priest. Now, as I said before, any one of these individual characteristics in and of themselves does not mean that the garden is a temple. But when you take all of these pieces collectively together and compare it against the rest of the biblical witness, that it's located in the east, is on a mountain, has a river, has trees, precious stones and metal, the presence of the cherubim, God's presence, Adam's responsibilities, Adam's post-fall vestments, I think the conclusion is clear that the Garden of Eden is the first temple of God. The one thing alone that should clue us into this, at least at a bare minimum, is that all you need is God's presence. And that immediately turns wherever he is into holy ground, as is evident from Moses at the burning bush. So God's presence alone should at least tell us this was a temple. But with all of these other features, it places, I think, not only the Garden of Eden, but also Adam's labors in a different light. Now, I see that we're at the top of the hour, and we are supposed to stop here and take a brief 5-minute break. So we'll break here, and we'll come back at 5 after. So go stretch, get some food, whatever we need to do, and we'll pick back up in about 5 minutes.